Good evening. Welcome to this latest educational session with... Good evening. Welcome to this latest meeting of the Republican Labour Education Forum. In this meeting, we'll be concentrating on the role of the Crown in the post office scandal. Sean Hudson of the CWU has kindly agreed to attend the meeting, and we will be asking questions of him later. Sean is the branch secretary of the CWU for sub-postmasters and mistresses. He gave an excellent presentation to the LLA trade union group just about a month ago. And since then, he's attended some very high-level meetings. And so we're looking forward to any further revelations he may have for us. We're going to start with an introduction by Steve Freeman and Phil Vellender, and then we're going to move on to Sean Hudson, and we'll be asking questions of him. We have some specific questions to ask, and then it will be thrown open to the floor to ask questions and make contributions to the topic. So let's start, first of all, with Steve Freeman and Phil Vellender.
Thank you, Carol. I'm going to use a few PowerPoints just to illustrate some points before we're going to try and keep our section within about 15 minutes or so. Hopefully we can. Obviously, we begin with the biggest miscarriage, what's called the biggest miscarriage of justice in UK legal history. And when you think about it, the innocent people went to jail and the criminals got off scot-free. They've not been prosecuted yet. I had a couple of quotes to begin with. One was from John Sweeney, who investigated the scandal back in 2015 for the Panorama program, Trouble at the Post Office. And he describes the post office as a machine that lied, the power of money, and an ancient British institution that had become a cult. And of course, the machine was the post office. We backed out with money. And the traditional ancient British institution was also the post office. So he's completely focused on the post office. And he says, of course, it happened to be, when you looked into it, that in 2015, Alice Perkins was both the chair of the post office, a member of the what's called Project Sparrow, which we might come on to later, and on the executive board of the BBC. And there was a tussle going on about whether the Panorama programme would be shown. So there was a real conflict of interest going on, and it shows some of the links and some of the connections. This week, I think it was Kevin Jones, Labour MP for North Durham, said that ministers need to clear the entirety of the management out, including the Chief Executive Officer, Nick Reed. Now that sounds tough, but in some ways, from our perspective, is covering up the source of the problem. We want to put forward the thesis that although most attention has been focused on the post office as a corporate body in charge of this criminal activity, we believe that it gives a misleading, as it were, biased view of what has taken place. We have to go higher up the food chain, as it were, to the Crown, that is to ministers, senior civil servants, and HM Treasury that controls and manipulates public expenditure. And that's the bit that nobody's really talking about in all of this. And the Crown is not, as I say, a benign institution, but one which is profoundly undemocratic and indeed a dangerous institution that has commissioned and committed many crimes against the people in the UK and across the world. We could just mention, of course, the unjust and cruel treatment of Julian Assange, who's now being held in a high security prison for I think 4 or 5 years, I'm not quite sure, without being found guilty of any crime. Anyway, I think what we thought we'd do, me and Phil, was I would put up some 3 or 4 diagrams, if you like, just so we can use those to frame what we're going to talk about. And what I'm going to try and do now, Carol, is to try and locate those things. I did, as I was writing this, remembered, Phil, just to say, I did remember Shelley talking about crimes of the Crown.
Oh, yeah.
And you'll know this because you're an expert on this.
Well, modern.
Okay. modest expert on it. But anyway, I had a little quote from Shelley, and I thought it was relevant to this. Do you think so?
Yeah, I think it's excellent.
He says a little bit in the way he's talking about. He says he's talking about the Peterloo massacre in 1819 and the role that the Crown played in that. And he comes to a little bit, says, next came fraud, and he had on, Phil, what did he have on? Like Eldon being the Home Secretary, an ermine gown. His big tears, for he wept well, turned to millstones as they fell. And I'm thinking there would be a lot of tears being shed by ministers of the Crown at the moment for the poor fate of the post officers. But they are millstones around the necks of the sub-postmasters.
Crucially, though, one of the ministers travels on a crocodile, which explains the kind of tears that Shelley is saying. He was riding on a crocodile. He's crying crocodile tears. It's exactly what's going on now.
Yeah, the scandal of the massacre of Peterloo, and then all the ministers are coming out shedding tears. Oh, it's terrible. Wish it never happened. When of course they're the ones that engineered the whole thing. But anyway, let's see if we can locate Carol. If I can, to go there, screen share. First thing I wanted to say, just as a quick to shape that diagram, so that I just thought, right, okay, let's hit this one. I think as a criminal conspiracy, I think we've got on that diagram, we want to put in the relationship between the Crown and the post office, between the Crown and Fujitsu, and of course the relationship between the post office and Fujitsu. And then, of course, down the bottom there, the sub-postmasters. So that's what we really want to be thinking about in that whole scenario. Because a lot of time, as I was looking at this select committee, and Sean will tell us later, but I think Fujitsu hardly gets a mention in the course of that. And I think they're a big part of this. And I don't know how that all works out, but I can't imagine they would have got those contracts with Fujitsu without government ministers being involved in the first place. But anyway. So let me move on a little bit to, here we go, Phil. So that's my first sort of diagram, if you like, just to think of the political system.
So how are you defining this Crown for as we always have a few people popping in who haven't maybe been here since before the beginning? So perhaps.
Well, I think.
Give us a little definition of the Crown.
Yes, well, people tend to think the Crown means the king, but it doesn't. It's really the term that we use for the state, except it's not just any state. It's the historically evolved state. So it's in a way, it's state power. And that's what we're really talking about. And the Crown is a power over the people. I mean, there's a relationship here between the Crown and Parliament and people. And our Constitution talks about sovereignty being vested in the Crown in Parliament. And I hear the Tories will always tell you there's parliamentary sovereignty, meaning that the Parliament can do no wrong. But that's actually not true. The Crown has a considerable amount of power through what its ministers do. So the Crown for me is not something you put on your head. It's not even the king, but it's that power of the state that is exercised through Parliament and over the people and over public opinion. And so therefore, if I take the next little just elaboration on that, Phil, if I could do that one, we'd have the Crown looking something like that. So that's the idea that the Crown, we would think of it as being a network of institutions, which are put up on there. If we can just move myself from there a minute. We are using the word the palace, obviously where the king's supposed to be, but it's an institution. Downing Street, Whitehall. But very, very important in all of this story has to be the Treasury, because the Treasury is by far the dominant institution of the Crown. Then you've got ministers of the Crown, you've got the courts, and then over on the other side, you've got the security service, armed forces, police, and prisons, and all those things. So we're thinking of the Crown as a set of institutions, a nexus of power, you might say, which we want to weave into this story, because I said at the beginning, the Crown doesn't really appear that much more obviously in this story. And I think, Phil, I'm going to ask you the next bit, really.
Okay.
Which is, if we want to just, before we go on, if we just have a little look at this diagram, because I think that gives us a bigger sense of what when you want to say about that, Phil.
Well, I've long held that the stratagem most commonly employed by the Crown in the UK, as in the colonies with the Kenya scandal and other, and indeed the Bengal famine, or the Biafran War, is that they employ a thing called a public inquiry or judge-led inquiry, which I crudely paraphrase as long grass syndrome, where you have a lot of blather for a few months, years, like in the inquiry into the shootings in Northern Ireland, which went on for 11 years, cost millions, and eventually seemed to end up with nobody knowing quite who'd done any more than they had before, except they did concede that there had been guilt on the part of the Crown in the shape of its soldiers, who of course swear to the Crown, not to the people. So what we've got here, I'm very briefly going through these. I'm going to start on the left and go around like the clock, going back anti-clockwise. Infected blood, the haemophilia scandal is one of the greatest miscarriages apart from the post office, really, because people have been suffering for this for so long, because it has been going on for many years without any recognition by ministers and others about it. And we can argue that the Birmingham 6, the Guildford 4, Stephen Lawrence followed similar patterns. I mean, they're quoted enough. People are always saying institutional racism in the police force, but they don't seem to have enacted the suggestions that the Macpherson report put into place. And I think this really is public theatre. It's designed to mollify, to blunt the desire of people for information and justice by wearing them down. I mean, God knows how long the COVID inquiry will go on for, and whether indeed that will realise any outcomes. I mean, basically, numbers of people should have been jailed for the financial crash in 2008. For Hillsborough, Windrush, again, is a long inquiry, judge-led, which is really just establishing the fact that corruption occurred, but will anyone go to jail for it? Well, no, because partly their conditions of giving evidence was that they wouldn't incriminate themselves. So even Michael Portillo said that he was shocked on the Andrew McNeil show one evening, I remember after the crash in 2008, that nobody had actually been jailed. Said it, and indeed, he tried to make America an example, but in fact, in America, only 1 or 2 people went to jail from the Fed for that appalling crash of Lehman Brothers. So moving on to foreign policy, I mentioned Kenya, and these are very important things like Kenya, Iraq, Grenfell. Why are they important? They're important because Grenfell is the importation back into this country of practice in the colonies of how to deal with ethnic minorities, so as they were seen, although of course they weren't the minority in the colonies. But you wear them down by waiting for them to die off. That's essentially the strategy that they adopt. People are fobbed off. Compensation is promised. Sean will have noticed the similarity here with certainly with Grenfell. They've been with Windrush. They've been promised compensation. The Kenya veterans were promised compensation years ago, and they waited. The Crown kept waiting until they were down to about 20 from the original 200. I think so. Windrush again, awful miscarriage of justice. Will anything happen? Orgreave again. You see, who cares about a few trade unionists getting their heads cracked? I mean, it's not really big news, is it? So we can give that an inquiry, and hopefully everyone will forget about it. So call me Mr. Cynical, but post office at the top of our picture, Sean's area, doesn't surprise me at all, because it's very much of a muchness with all the other public inquiries that the Crown has carried out. Now, there will be people who defend these inquiries, and they're quite right to do so, because they do turn up valuable information. But if I could make a linguistic comparison, it's like learning vocabulary in a language. If you don't have it joined to a tree, they're like leaves of a tree. They are lying on the ground. They fall on the ground, and these pieces of vocabulary, they have no logical connection. They just become brown leaves and get swept away. And that's kind of what happens with this information. We all end up with lots of information, but because the Crown operates the way it does, because our Parliament is, and that was clear from the way Starmer behaved last week with the SNP motion, that's the Crown in action in Parliament, the Crown in Parliament. Sovereign Parliament being manipulated by those behind the scenes of the Crown. That was a perfect example. And these people are operating the system to their own benefit. And indeed, the last thing I'll say on this is foreign policy is vital to remember that the Crown still elaborates foreign policy directly through the Foreign Office. That is how it operates. So what was going on in Afghanistan with that atrocious chaos at the airport, people being supposed to be taken away from Afghanistan, brought back, and dumping all our translators and so on the tarmac, that was the Crown in action. So I'll leave it there for the moment, if I may.
Yeah, sure. I'm just going to add one there. I'm going to add one there just to you, Phil, which of course is everything that's been happening in the Middle East at the moment with the Houthis, sure. What's going on in Cyprus, all that's being operated, the supply of arms, that's all being worked literally behind the backs of Parliament in a sense, although the Parliament's so corrupted it wouldn't bother to investigate anyway.
Well, it couldn't wanted to because it's under-resourced.
Yes, and but the Crown has reserved to itself foreign policy.
Yes,
and the appointment of ambassadors. Whereas domestic policy, it's a kind of different thing, but in foreign policy, it isn't. Okay, let's move on then a little bit, and then we'll move on to hear from Sean. I'm going to do that one. So I've got this one here. So I've got this little diagram where we've got obviously the post office there. These are some of the players, I think, in the story that, as I was looking at the story, came to me. Obviously, you've got the post office and the sub-post masters, and obviously they are close to the people. They are actually living with the people. Then you've got the BBC and ITV. I didn't mention the ITV, the Mr. Bates recent play that was so powerful. But you had this 2015 Panorama programme. You had Private Eye took up the case. Computer Weekly took up the case. So publicity is important in influencing public opinion. Then you have the role of Parliament. And this week, and that's probably what we're going to start talking about with Sean, the role of the Select Committee in Parliament in looking into this. And then you had the role of the courts. In famously the case in 2019, the High Court case, when 580 postmasters made a joint case in the High Court, and that came really from publicity that had been gained earlier. But even when you look at that story, the thing that's really kind of missing from that story, of course, is all of that. That's people are not looking up to the higher point. They're not looking up so much to what the Department of Business and Trade is doing. And especially they're not looking to what is the real power in the Crown, which is HM Treasury and how that operates. And it operates beyond scrutiny. So I think we got the elements of the story where the idea was to speak now with Sean and bring Sean into this story. So I'll stop screen sharing, I think.
Right. So thank you very much, Sean, for attending the meeting this evening. Now, we've got some specific questions that we'd like to ask you, and then we'd like to throw it open to anybody in the meeting to ask questions of you or make a contribution. So I'll leave it to Steve and Phil to ask some questions of you.
The first thing, Sean, that I wanted to just ask you was if there's just the brief summary of the story, or add to anything, and any key turning points that there might be in the story that appear to you.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for having me along tonight. And I'm sorry for messing you around last week. I was actually at a meeting with Post Office senior execs last week on the Monday and still travelling back when your meeting was due to start. The question about any key points, probably the greatest key point in this story in terms of how it arrived at the public eye and under public scrutiny is the very first thing that happened to bring it there, and the happen chance of that. And this is how things happen sometimes. Seema Misra, who was one of the sub-postmasters who was convicted as a result of Horizon and corrupt evidence and failure to disclose, her husband tweeted to Nick Wallace, the journalist who wrote the book, The Great Post Office Scandal. Long before the book was written, this guy, Seema Misra's husband, tweeted Nick Wallace at the radio station asking if he could bid for the radio station's taxi account. And as a result of that, the two men met each other, and he offered a story to Nick Wallace, which was all about Seema Misra and her conviction. And arising from that happen chance, a whole chain of events was put in place and occurred, without which that one tweet, we possibly might never have got to the point that we are now. And it was largely as a result of that, which managed to gather the oxygen of publicity for these events. And quite often, without the oxygen of publicity, groups of people can bang on about it as much as they like and as much as they want to, but somehow you have to find the flavor of the week, the month, or whatever to bring it into the public eye. And eventually that happened, from that one tweet to the TV drama Bates v Post Office. And I think that's probably one of the greatest turning points. It's possibly a slightly disappointing one. It's a minor one, but without that one single tweet, we might not have got to the position in which we are today.
I mean, I just to add to that point, to say that obviously we're talking about the massive power of the Crown and all the institutions that it controls, but we're not living in a dictatorship. We're living in a kind of elected, somebody would call it elected dictatorship. Public opinion still works. People demonstrating on the street still work. There are lots of ways in which these things can get out and publicity can get out. And therefore, the Crown, the ministers, and that are still shaped or affected, as is Parliament, by the fact that the people know about it. If the people get to hear about it or know about it or understand it, that's does still make change possible. And
well, every effort was made once the events gathered a momentum of their own. And we had with Alan Bates the formation of the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance. And I think it was originally 580 odd postmasters. And by the time of the litigation, when it was issued, it was 555, and they're commonly called the 555. The Crown played its part in that because forever and a day, UK government investments, who is the sole shareholder of Post Office, have always had and continue to have sitting on the board a director from UK government investments. And the Crown played a major part in the Bates litigation when it was clear that Post Office was losing hands down in making the application to recuse Justice Fraser, who was the judge dealing with the case. And it was said when that application was dealt with that the decision to make the application came from, and I quote, board level. And of course, who would be sitting on the board, but also the representative from UK government investments. So for government to say that they didn't know what was going on is a bit of a stretch. And in fact, Henry Staunton has, I think in his recent article in the Times and everything that's spun around since then, has called that out and said it's convenient for government to hide behind, I think as he quoted it, the skirts of Post Office Limited. And that's what they do, and that's what they have been doing.
Yeah, they have to keep they have to keep out of the they want people to see one thing, but not to see their own role in it. And so I'm going to ask you about the the recent select committee. That I was having a look at it yesterday, but I know you've been watching it very carefully, and maybe you were there. I don't know if you were there, but I wonder what you think we've learnt from that select committee, because that Staunton thing is a real embarrassment, and it does open up the idea that the Crown was involved all the way along, and none of this could have happened if ministers hadn't known about it, and if top civil servants hadn't known about it.
I don't think there's any doubt that the Crown knew about it all along, just by dint of the simple fact, as I say, that UK Government Investments is the sole shareholder of Post Office, and they have a director who sits on the board. So there can be no doubt that the Crown didn't know what was going on. As I say, that application came from board level, which included the director from UK Government Investments. The select committee, the most recent select committee last Tuesday, that was principally to deal with issues of postmaster redress and compensation, and it was for an update about the progress of that. That was the principal issue there, which is probably the reason why I think you raised why Fujitsu weren't appearing very heavily at the moment in terms of select committees. Certainly in relation to the last select committee, that's why Fujitsu didn't appear in it, because they weren't on the agenda as such. The select committee prior to that, Fujitsu did appear, and their UK director made a public apology. But apologies on their own don't butter the parsnips, and the proof will come down to the pudding and the eating in terms of how much Fujitsu are prepared or will pay in compensation to UK government, to Post Office, to help balance the books. But there is potentially a major issue there in relation to Fujitsu and what they say and what they do being two separate things, because the major issue hiding in the wings there with Fujitsu is that if they fail to produce a decent level of compensation or contribution to compensation, then the next recourse is litigation. But the problem potentially in terms of litigation is that the litigation must normally be brought within 6 years. And where it isn't, it's possible for lawyers to agree a standstill agreement, which effectively freezes the limitation period. There's no indication or suggestion that the standstill has operated in relation to Post Office and Fujitsu from when it first became known. So there may well be limitation issues that are going to be at play. Fujitsu will probably know that. In fact, I'm sure they know it. So to an extent, the level of contribution that Fujitsu offered, they will always have in the back of their mind, well, they can play hardball if need be, and just put the brakes on that and leave it to Post Office to enter the Post Office Limited to enter the mire of litigation with Fujitsu, with always the possibility of a limitation defence.
Yeah, that's interesting. Can you just say a little bit more about the row between the Post Office? This did come out at the select committee. The row between the sacked chair Henry Staunton and the ministers, Kemi Badenoch, and the senior civil servants there. What's the significance of all of that?
I think the spat between Badenoch and Staunton appears to have arisen by dint of the fact of the nature of his dismissal. And he had a story to tell, and he's gone to the Times and told that story. And in telling that story, Badenoch's first offence appears to be to rubbish him and come out fighting. And then Staunton has managed to find, in effect, what is a contemporaneous note of the meeting that he had with the senior civil servant, which on the face of it backs up what Staunton has said. And then the bombshell that fell in the select committee last Tuesday is the fact that he quite mischievously and innocently dropped in to the committee. Don't you realise this report isn't about me, it's about Nick Reed. And the 80-page whistleblowing document is all about Nick Reed, and Staunton features only in a couple of paragraphs or possibly even one paragraph of that report. And then suddenly at the select committee, it goes from a document being about Staunton to being about Nick Reed, which nobody was aware of or knew of at the select committee until it was revealed.
I mean, I watched the select committee. I was watching the select committee on BBC Parliament, and the shock that those MPs had, it was like the whole management structure probably fell apart at that moment. They were absolutely gobsmacked to find out that the chief executive was within some sort of deep trouble that they didn't know about. But
yeah,
no doubt the ministers knew all about that, though, of course.
And I mean, Grant Shapps, for example, knew that as far as Nick Reed was concerned, he was looking for a pay rise and wanted a pay packet of around about 1 million, because Staunton had discussions with him about that. And again, I think Staunton, to quote him, had said, "Don't even bother with a postage stamp to send me that request, because it's not going to be met." So it moved from being about the dossier being about Nick Reed to the subject of him wanting a pay rise as well, to a packet of 1 million or in excess of 1 million with bonuses.
Yeah. I mean, that you've got the kind of whistleblowing, except he's the most respectable city, Staunton I'm talking about, is the most sort of respectable city businessman with lots of credibility behind him, and he goes and blows the whistle on the whole thing, and it does then start to show up more of the way in which things work, which you don't normally see, because he's opened up the fact of the role of ministers and civil servants. Basically, the argument, as far as I can see, I mean, if this is how you see it, that the Treasury doesn't want to pay out that much money. They'd like to delay it or hold it back if they possibly could. So they're being told, the ministers are telling them, try and slow it all down if you could, because it serves our political interests at that moment in time. That's how I've interpreted that.
And I think that's the interpretation that the select committee took away from last week's committee as well. Perhaps not necessarily from the point of view of accepting what Staunton said, that he had been told with a nod and a wink to slow down payment, rather than it being that simply is a demonstration of how the compensation process has unfolded, that the reality of that is it has been delay. And the best estimate at the moment, I think, that the post office directors appearing before the committee could give in terms of when it might be resolved was possibly 1.5 years, possibly 2 years, much to the amazement of Liam Byrne and others on the committee.
Yeah.
So regardless of whether or not post office have had the instruction from the Treasury on high to slow down things, whether or not that's accepted or not, the actuality of what's happened in any event is that things have just dragged on and dragged on and dragged on and dragged on, and sadly are likely to drag on as well, until probably post office is removed completely from the compensatory process.
I mean, that's the story in all of the scandals that Phil talked about before. They're all drag on and drag on. They're always coming up too little, too late. And that's because there's not enough democratic pressure on those institutions to do that. They managed to slow it down because of the way that power works.
So well, Salad Javid, sorry to interrupt, Salad Javid actually said when he took over from Amber Rudd, who you remember resigned in ignominy in front of quite honourably, actually, because she felt she should have been paid more attention to those civil servants. But anyway, that's Javid said that the Windrush, he assured the House in 2018 or whenever it was, that the Windrush compensation would be starting within the next 6 weeks. And I think, well, we can treat that with the derision it deserves, and also see similarities to your situation, Sean. And also, I think it's worth noting that Mick Lynch talks about how ministers hide behind these companies, but really they're the ones deciding how much pay is going to be given. So they can't negotiate with the rail companies because the ministers basically are paying them not to negotiate.
it's yet again how government hides behind the skirts of the front-facing companies. So, in say for the case of the rail networks, the private rail companies, but government hides behind them in terms of negotiations. And with regard to post office, government hides behind Post Office Limited. For a long, long time before the Bates litigation, whenever questions came up in the House about what was happening and how things were being dealt with, the standard answer was, well, it's an arm's length company and questions must be referred to Post Office Limited. Along comes Bates v Post Office as a TV drama, and suddenly the government's falling over itself to be seen in the public spotlight and be seen to be trying to sort things out, because it's a poster boy for making it look as if you're doing something active in government that means something, which is sorely needed at the moment and has been for a long, long time.
I mean, can I ask you another question then? Do you think does the Treasury come up much in this story? Are they kept at distance from it? Because it always seems to be they're the ones that really pull in the strings. I don't know whether that's come across in any of the things that you have to deal with, but they always seem to be the power behind the throne to me, anyway.
I don't think directly in the sense that anybody said to us, well, we have to run this past the Treasury, but I mean, the Prime Minister's title is the First Lord of the Treasury. Exactly. So it all comes back to the Treasury in any event. And everybody knows that whatever decision is taken or move that's taken that has any financial impact, which is pretty much everything, it's got to get past the Treasury first. And if it doesn't get past the Treasury, it isn't going to happen.
Absolutely. I'm going to say I've got a few more questions, but I'm going to really open up to the floor, give everybody else a chance. So I'm going to ask you a couple more questions, Sean, and then see what the comrades from the floor have to say. Carol said something to me. She said that the Fujitsu Horizon system was rejected by the DWP, but it was accepted by the Post Office. And I don't know if you'd come across that idea before, because it is, well, why would that be? I mean, I don't know. I had a guess at it, but I wondered if you've come across that idea.
I think Post Office simply bet the farm on it, and by then they were too far into things, and Fujitsu were making threats that if they withdrew from it, there would be further expenses to pay, etc. And I think to some extent their hand was forced with that, and government's hand was forced with that, because the DWP scenario and Fujitsu is one government department, but when you consider the remaining government contracts that have been given, and since the Bates scandal and judgment have carried on to be given to Fujitsu, in a sense, it's too big to fail and government doesn't have somewhere else to turn to. One of the big worries for postmasters at the moment is the system that's being developed to replace Horizon, because let's not forget, Horizon is the same system that postmasters are still using, and that's the flawed system that gave rise to the biggest judicial scandal in UK legal history. That system is still being used. Post Office are developing a new system to replace it. Post Office were instrumental with Fujitsu in developing Horizon. So there are a lot of worried eyes on what's happening at the moment in terms of the replacement system.
Well, I mean, I'm going to ask you one other question, and then one about democracy, another way. But just this last one was that I did wonder. I asked you this before, and I think on the trade union meeting. But this fraud was committed. You know, was this fraud committed by the Post Office? Was it an accident, as it were, down to a computer programming error, or a deliberate policy they found a way to extort a large amount of money from the sub post offices? I mean, or it could be both. In other words, there was a mistake and some errors, and they suddenly realised. Because I heard this, one of the sub postmasters at a select committee saying, first of all, it began, you know, I'd be a few pounds out each week, like you're getting pulled into a scam, you know, and I'd put my own money in, and, you know, fill the hole in the accounts, and then it started getting bigger and before you knew where you are, you're owing thousands of pounds, as if somebody was controlling the whole thing, like reeling you in getting you used to it, and then really hitting you with a very heavy bill. Now, you have to wonder whether, is this a way in which they were starting to make money out of their workforce and another way of making profit? I don't know.
I don't know if it was a deliberate act, but certainly as a byproduct of that, postmasters were putting in an awful lot of money from their own pocket, and it was money to replace holes in their accounts which actually didn't exist.
Yeah.
So if I on a day have to put £5,000 into my branch account to settle it off, where that money has never actually been missing, Post Office Limited have gained themselves £5,000. Multiply that across the network, and what happened was it all went into a suspense account, and then ultimately, as it passed into Post Office accounts, it then became part of Post Office Limited income, and which fed the performance-related pay of senior executives and entitled them to bonuses and greater bonuses for the fact that they were making greater profit. A lot of that profit coming from postmasters putting their hands in their pockets to replace phantom losses.
Yeah.
Whether or not it was a deliberate act, I don't know, but it certainly suited purposes in terms of bonuses, etc., and payments.
Yeah, and even if it was an accidental thing at the beginning, they would be so committed to it. It would become built in, wouldn't it? They wouldn't give it up once it got going, because it's such a source of bonuses, as you say, for them.
Well, they became absolutely committed to it because they couldn't acknowledge that there were problems with the Horizon infrastructure, and to have done that would have opened the floodgates as they saw it, which was in fact the whole rationale again or behind Project Sparrow, which recently came up as well, which was the Post Office deciding to in effect sack Ian Henderson in second sight, because by then they were getting to the root of the problem, and it was an inconvenient truth that was emerging.
That's right. That was a secret committee, wasn't it? Project Sparrow,
2014,
where they were set up to sabotage second sight.
That's right.
I'm going to end on this point before opening up to the rest of the comrades, Sean. I was going to ask you about democracy. So the power of the crown is what dominates this story for me. But the other side of it is the power of democracy in a way. And I think that's a very important element of this story. It's only when people begin to organise do they begin to get out of that hole. So can I just ask you about the role of unions and the role of campaigning and democratic organisations and people organisations is so important in this story?
Well, the role of the National Federation of Sub-Postmasters, who on the face of it sound like the Postmasters Union, was absolutely abhorrent. The National Federation of Sub-Postmasters are paid for as a result of a general funding arrangement entered into between the Federation and Post Office Limited. Post Office Limited pay them, I think it's around 2 million a year in terms of grants to fund themselves. And the basis of that grant is that they shouldn't be seen and won't be seen to, in effect, badmouth Post Office. And if they do, then they put themselves at risk in terms of the future of that grant funding. So we had the situation in which what was on the face of things, the Postmasters Union, and incidentally the Federation was struck off as a trade union, so it's certainly not that. We had on the face of things the Postmasters Trade Union supposedly looking after them and actually throwing postmasters to the wolves. The Communication Workers Union arose as a result of, in particular, one of the Fed's executive officers becoming very disgruntled and leaving, and then forming a branch of Postmasters Union under the Communication Worker Union umbrella. And we saw a period in which this particular individual was looking after postmasters where the Federation was failing to look after postmasters. It wasn't until Alan Bates founded the JFSA, Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance, that people were able to come together and recognise that, contrary to what Post Office said, it wasn't only them and there were others, and they were all having similar and same problems. So it was collective activity ultimately that brought about the change that there is. And again, largely by happen chance as well. If we had had a truly independent postmasters union, which the Federation certainly wasn't, then it may well have been the case, and I suspect would have been the case, that this thing wouldn't have ran away with itself in the way that it has done. I still have situations in which postmasters who are facing losses are putting their hands into their pockets and paying those losses back to post office on a regular basis since the Bates litigation, whereas members of my union know that that's not something that they should be doing, because post office must prove the loss is effectively down to them, and effectively if they can't do that, then they don't put their hands in their pocket.
I mean, this is again a massive case for why you should be in a trade union. Obviously,
Absolutely, it is. Absolutely.
And if you don't have an independent trade union, you are going to get shafted, basically. Yeah. I mean, that's a story that we all know as trade unionists, why that's important. And that is the other side of the story, the power of the Crown. It actually is being stopped by people organising and getting a decent trade union. And actually, Alan Bates, when he finds out that he's not the only one, there's somebody else here, somebody else there, and you see on the TV program all the people slowly coming together and more coming together, and the collectivity of doing that is fantastic. It's very inspiring.
Well, it's as a result of Alan Bates' tenacity and the fact that he wouldn't let it go and kept at it and at it and at it.
Yeah. We saw that on the thing. I'm going to stop. I mean, there are other things to add, but I'm going to stop that, I think, Sean, because I think Carol, I'll go pass you back to Carol, because obviously other comrades who might want to come in and have questions to ask as well. But thank you for doing that. And it's a story that's ongoing, and hopefully we can keep in contact with you as it goes along. That's really good.
There are a lot of developments to come. It's
I mean, maybe before we end, maybe if we hear other comrades speaking, maybe at the end, Sean, if we come back to you, you may just give us some of those things that at the end when you're summing up, perhaps things that might be of significance that we'd be interested to hear about. Back to you, Carol.
That would be great at the end. I've got I can see Mike clapping. There's great appreciation for your answers. Thank you, Sean. I've got 4 people now with their hands up. I'm going in order. If I could ask people to try and keep their questions or contributions to 3 minutes, so that we got a chance to get to everybody who wants to speak. So I'm going to John Tumman first. So I'm going to spotlight there. So John, do go ahead.
Thank you very much, Carol. Thank you very much, Sean. If I can, I want to try and shed some light on the conversation that just took place between Sean and Steve, trying to make sense of the continued and increased extraction of money from the accounts of sub-postmasters. And what I want to look at, because my own experience, is procurement. Procurement works differently, I would suggest, for at the national level than it does at the local level, where local authorities had to bear in mind all sorts of different things, guidance and statutory guidance in relation to entering into contracts to carry out work under the auspices of local authorities. It doesn't work that way under central government. For some years, I was working for the Commission for Racial Equality Legal Action team, and we had a computer system foisted upon us, which was sold to the Commission as if it were a bespoke system. It was not ever a bespoke system. It was a general off-the-peg system devised by the computer company. And I want to suggest that this is probably the case in this instance of the sub-postmasters dispute and scandal. because I would guess that Fujitsu didn't design a bespoke system and in negotiation with the post office, and then the post office bought it off Fujitsu. I would suggest that it involved the state directly, and that something like this happened, that this off-the-peg system devised by Fujitsu was sold to the post office, and that the state told the post office they had to live with it and sell it as a bespoke system for the post office. And that therefore the answer to the question, why did these amounts keep on increasing and so on, was that that was built into the system from the start. And I think that may well emerge from when Fujitsu seriously takes the stand, if it ever does. For central national contracts, I think that we don't really know how procurement happens. Maybe it happens by discretion in different ways on different occasions, but it could also be true that what happens is that the relationship between the Crown and particular companies that they are used to using is a very close one, and that together the Crown goes to the public, the national public sector organisations, and I'm suggesting all public sector organisations are vulnerable in this way. And something
John, you've had over 4 minutes.
I'll finish now. A general off-the-peg system actually is sold to the public sector agency and its employees and departments and regional offices as a bespoke system, and it is not. And that's where the problems start, and that's where they come from.
I think that was.
Are you,
think that
Sean,
was-
would you like to take each person in turn, or would you like to have a couple more and then come back with answers? How would you like to do it?
I'd probably answer one at a time, if that's all right.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, absolutely.
So I think the situation with the Horizon system and its genesis is that it was pretty much cobbled together. It was being required to do too many things. It could do one thing, and then it was a case of, well, we'll tack this on and we'll tack that on and we'll tack this on, we'll tack something else on. And it was pretty much cobbled together and put together when engineers and coders knew that it was being asked too much of. And the problem was that Post Office bet the farm on it in terms of the system that was going to work and take postmasters away from paper records and satisfy what was a government requirement then as well, which was everything was being pushed online and pushed to IT. But very much Horizon was subsequently seen with hindsight as something that was cobbled together and tacked together. At the time it was seen as that as well, but that was hushed up.
Thank you very much, Sean. Does that answer your question, John?
I think it does, and it confirms my suspicion that Fujitsu had an existing product which they wanted to flog, and in cahoots with government, worked out which of the public agencies it might fly with, and they ended up with the post office, and then they tried to add these little bits to it to make it fit and to make it credible to call it a bespoke system and to sell it as such, and for the post office to sell it as such to sub postmasters.
Thank you very much, John. I'm going to go now to Mike and then to Tony.
Yeah, well, Sean, thanks a lot, because you really come at this very calmly but with surgical precision. It's really, really helpful. And in regard to what John's just asked, I think there's a lot in that. I've had some experience with regard to NHS and social care computer systems, and they are indeed cobbled together. That's exactly right. And those commissioning them really know exactly what they're buying, and everybody's running around trying to please those above them. That hierarchical aspect, I think, really is at all elements of this story is about pleasing the hierarchy and don't rock the boat. I just wanted to ask a question, though, in relation to something that Steve said. Steve, you said that when the light of democracy is shone on this, that gets them jumping around. Well, yes, but what happened in the case of Staunton? Okay, he's not democracy exactly, but he's a man in the system who should have been a chap and held together and not some, not rock the boat. And he did rock the boat. And he came out and said some things which are rather too true. So what happens? They rubbish him. And they start producing civil servants to try and disprove him. And they start saying that, well, he's a bit old, kind of echoes of Trump and Biden suddenly we have. And a whole load of other things. There's no doubt sort of a dark arts department that's skullduggerously digging around in his history, trying to find things which they can use to discredit him. Mm-hmm. And in the case, I'm put in mind also the very current sort of situation with regard to Gaza and all the demonstrations, massive presence, massive lobby of Parliament last week. The state is panicked, certainly, but also they go into hyperdrive to suggest that this is a mob and people are in danger. And, Starmer clearly is producing all this guff now. Sunak, but Starmer equally did it in relation to putting pressure on the speaker and suggesting that there was almost a danger of sort of people breaking in and doing injury to MPs. Complete and utter nonsense. The Dark Arts Department is deployed, so it's not a question that they give up. It by any means. I think I think the state becomes more dangerous at this point when it is under threat. And I'd like to hear people's views on that, not least your own, Sean.
Thanks very much.
Well, it continues in relation to Staunton, because after he gave evidence to the select committee, the department continued to rubbish him. And now their position is they don't comment in terms of ongoing investigations. Well, before Staunton turned up to the select committee and was able to produce his contemporaneous email, they were quite prepared to continue rubbishing Staunton and continue to comment on what was an ongoing investigation. But once Staunton was able to stand up and defend himself in a way, they suddenly decided they would pull the shutters down and say, oh, we don't comment on ongoing investigations, because that was the convenience to them at that time. Well, I mean, to me, one of the big takeaways with Staunton's comments to the select committee is as well that he did say that it's not just about redress for wrongly convicted postmasters and postmasters who have had to put their hands in their pockets in terms of the Horizon scandal. It's also about the fact that there will be no post office network of sub postmasters shortly to speak of, unless they make a massive cash injection into postmasters' incomes, because we're all of us working on less than the living wage, less than the minimum wage. It's our retail that subsidises the post office, without altruistic postmasters saying, well, I'm going to keep the post office here for XYZ reasons. And there can be no financial reason for that, because it doesn't wash its face. It doesn't pay for itself. Without that happening,
we know that the Israeli Defense Force has been arresting people in Gaza. They have been taking people.
I'm sorry.
So that was a major point from my point of view and my members' point of view as well, was what Staunton said with regard to existing sub-postmasters and the existing network, because pretty soon that will disappear. I had an email from a member wanting to cancel their membership with immediate effect. And I asked why it was, as you would do, it was that the member wanted to cancel their membership, to make sure it wasn't something that had not been done that should have been done, or said that shouldn't have been said, etc. And the response was simply that they were making cuts and they couldn't afford the subscriptions any longer.
This is really, really shocking that postmasters are subsisting on such low salaries. It's just dreadful. I'm going to bring in Tony Greenstein and then John Spedding.
Yeah, I want to introduce a slightly different angle, if you like. We've concentrated on the role of, quite understandably, Siemens, the post office management, and so on. But there's also the courts. I mean, there was a decision in 2019, but from what I understand, and you'll correct me, I'm sure, postmasters were being convicted from about 2005 onwards. Correct me, I say I'm not up on all the details. And yet these cases continued to occur throughout the years. And it wouldn't have taken a genius at the Department of Justice to realise that there was something wrong. I mean, yes, maybe one or two are guilty of fraud or theft or what have you, but 700 or so, I mean, I don't know whether that is the total figure, but that seems to be what's been quoted. And questions should be raised about the justice system and about the ability of someone who is accused by a big corporation of these offences to be able to challenge them. Because, for example, there is, I understand, a piece of legislation which basically says that if you're alleging that it was a computer and not me, you have to prove it. And yet they are given no means of proving it. They don't have access to expert witnesses. They don't have the right to send people into Siemens to actually see what they're up to. They don't have really any ability to stand up to the big forces and battalions ranged against them. I mean, you will be allocated a solicitor and a barrister who is really on their own. So it seems to me there is a whole different angle which hasn't really been pursued, leaving aside the fact that some judges were so vicious that they actually sent first-time offenders to prison without any record whatsoever in order to provide a deterrent. And I think these people should be named. Who were some of these judges? I'd be quite interested, because I'm thinking of writing a blog on the legal aspect of it, which doesn't seem to have figured very highly, and it reflects on, if you like, the whole justice system. Because I mean, Steve talks about the Crown. Well, the Crown for me is the state, and the state consists of a number of different prongs, from the police and Parliament, corporations and civil servants, but it also includes probably the most reactionary part in many ways, which are the judges themselves. I mean, they're the ones, for instance, who preside over the miscarriage of justice in the case of Julian Assange, as they did in the Irish cases, where they sponsored and pioneered the miscarriages of justice. Anyone who remembers the appeal of the Birmingham Six, presided over by Lord Justice Lane, who with two other judges summed up and said, the longer we've heard this appeal, the more we are convinced that these men are guilty. This was after a welter of evidence had been produced, including the discrediting of all the forensic evidence. So I think it may be useful, because if you don't concentrate and focus on the justice system, such miscarriages of justice will reoccur in the future, because there is no fail-safe mechanism, and this will simply be treated as a one-off. So that is my take on it, and I'd obviously be interested to hear what your observations are, Sean.
The justice system undoubtedly does have its part to play, because if the justice system had been operating properly and had been fit for purpose in that sense, then again, we probably wouldn't have had the situation that we do. One of the big issues was the change in legislation to the assumption that the computer was right, and it was for the defendant, in effect, to prove that the computer was wrong, and that largely arose out of the CAMAC breathalyzing systems, when we had a series of prosecutions that were being overturned in relation to drink driving after challenges as to whether or not the computer equipment was working properly. And to counter that, with the pendulum swung too far the other way, to the extent that the computer was always right, and it was down to the individual to prove that the computer was wrong. And of course, the only way that you can prove that the computer is wrong is if you're given sufficient access to the data that you need from the computer banks and sources, and you have somebody with sufficient expertise to be able to interpret that data. And in fact, I think Seema Misra's case herself, she actually had, I think, an expert in relation to computer evidence, but they didn't manage to get things over the line because of evidence that was being put forward by Fujitsu and Post Office to counter that evidence. And we had various failings in the disclosure system in relation to the judicial system as well. Disclosure requires that the prosecution should disclose all documents that are relevant to the case, and that includes, because of relevance being the watchword there, documents that are relevant to the defense, not just relevant to the prosecution. And in actual fact, what was happening was that there was a complete failure in disclosure, and relevant documents were not being disclosed. And had they been disclosed, then there very likely wouldn't have been the prosecutions that there were. I think that there was, in many respects, some lazy lawyering went on. I think there was, in many respects, some situations in which judges were being presented with evidence, and on the basis that every solicitor and barrister that appears before the court as an officer of the Supreme Court knows their duty to the court, there was an assumption that what was being presented to the judge was absolutely correct, when in fact it clearly wasn't. And there's a great question mark now over internal counsel and how they managed to square their duty to the court, and at the same time their duty to their employer, for example, Post Office. How do you square those duties? Because clearly in-house counsel wants to get the best result that they can for their employer, Post Office Limited, whereas they actually still have a professional duty as well. And there was a great blurring of those lines. The SRA, I think the Solicitors Regulatory Authority, is one of the core participants in the Wynne-Williams inquiry, and they are watching. And I think before the Bates TV drama, I wasn't necessarily confident that there would be action taken at the end of the inquiry against certain parties. Since the Bates TV drama, I'm more confident that that will happen. And I think things will probably move in terms of criminal prosecutions and in terms of professional proceedings against certain lawyers as well.
Can I ask, firstly, when the criminal prosecutions first started, and secondly,
Well,
from-
even before the Horizon system, there were criminal prosecutions. The thing that
yeah,
people talk, but the criminal prosecutions weren't based on computer data. Postmasters used to keep a paper ledger of their figures and balance those at the end of each week. The postmaster's contract, which is unchanged since the Bates litigation, states that the sub-postmaster is responsible for all losses caused through his own negligence, carelessness, or error, and also for losses of all kinds caused by his assistants. Deficiencies must be made good without delay. That was fine so long as things were on paper ledgers, but when it moved to the computer, there was no change made in the contract. And you'll notice that says the sub-postmaster is responsible for all losses caused through his own negligence, carelessness, or error, and also for losses of all kinds. If you can't prove that it wasn't as a result of your negligence or carelessness, the loss fell to you. And that was what the Bates litigation found, was that term in the contract was unfair.
when did the Horizon prosecutions arise? Because they're the really germane ones.
The Horizon prosecution started, I think, around 2012, and they gathered pace. In fact, no, it's 2000. Between 1999 and 2014, so they actually started back in 1999.
Right, is that early? When was Horizon introduced again? Sorry.
1998.
Horizon was 1999, and prior to that, you had the capture system as well.
Right, okay.
The predecessor of a precursor to Horizon.
Yeah.
Can I just comment briefly that
Tony, can we just, I've got two more people who've got their hands up, and you've had a lot of time now. Can I move on to other people?
yeah, sure, of course.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to bring in John Spedding now.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Sean. That was very good, all the way from Gateshead. Well done. I've got an awful lot of notes here. Anyway, the Crown now does not act through Parliament. The Crown really ignores Parliament, and it acts through ministers, and that's been possible since 2012, when they changed the responsibility of ministers. And I see we go on to the little spat, Staunton and Badenoch. Kemi Badenoch sees herself as a future Tory leader. She'd already stood for leadership once, and she didn't like it that she was found out. We all know, I think, that we're in the midst of a change of government by the end of this year, and the Tory party have quite cleverly decided that they're going to recompense, they say, the sub-postmasters by the end of the year. Well, I can guarantee they won't do it by the end of the year, and they're leaving something between £1 and £2 billion worth of debt for the Labour government to pick up when they come into power. One thing that we need to realise is that this whole story started in about 1995, 1996, when John Major had Ian Lang as the business minister, and it wasn't the post office at that time, it was the Royal Mail Group. Post office was part of the Royal Mail Group, and it wasn't hived off the Royal Mail Group until 2012. We're all encouraged not to involve any of the personalities in the Royal Mail Group in all this, but people like John Roberts and Adam Crozier were in charge 1999, 2000 and onwards up to 2005, and no one has mentioned their names here yet, and they were ultimately responsible. And of course, Adam Crozier was, and still is, he went from Royal Mail Group to ITV, I wonder why ITV didn't produce that story after he left. To me, Paula Venables, yes, she was responsibility, and Vanden Bogert was responsible, and she was a terrible woman. Is a terrible woman, but there are bigger fish out there, and they're all named Minister for Business in the Crown. You notice that when Kemi Badenoch was trying to defend herself, she got Sarah Munby to write this report for her, which was written a year after the meeting with Henry Staunton, when Henry Staunton actually had contemporaneous notes. So I thought that was quite amusing that she had to rely on that. Sean, you're quite right. The Post Office Limited is a loss-making company, and it will continue to lose. And if they're forced to pay for this, they're going to be another £1 billion down the drain, and things aren't going to get any better. It was interesting to me that it was the Scots law that enabled judges, the procurator in Scotland, there was a procurator fiscal. The procurator fiscal refused to take certain cases to court, even though the investigators had witness statements which ignored the errors, bugs. Oh, well, I can't remember what the terminology they use in the inquiry, but the bugs and errors in the program. The Post Office investigators, if you've watched any of the inquiry YouTube videos, these people were at best incompetent, at worst bullying, and self-justifying. They made money from the amount of money that their bonus related to the amount of money that they got back from the post office, the postmaster. And it turned out in the end that the legal team, the post office legal solicitors, were writing witness statements for the Post Office Limited investigators, and they were signing these witness statements without reading them, and they couldn't stand up in the inquiry and say anything about it. They were absolutely they were run rings round by the King's Counsel that were asking the questions. I think Carol and I were both quite amused at times by how poorly they answered the questions. Anyway, that's it. Thank you.
I think it's been quite interesting to watch the inquiry and the collective amnesia that's mostly developed around post office witnesses. And for those that don't have amnesia, the arrogance and the disdain to which they approach the inquiry with. And then because they're quite willing to talk because they think they know best, the rings that get run round them and the knots they get tied into. So you have the two extremes. You have the collective amnesia, and on the other hand, the lunatics.
Yeah.
Right, I'm going to bring Steve, and I'm going to bring Richard first, and then Steve. So, Richard, I'm going to bring you in now. Richard Sampson.
Hi. Well, first of all, apologies because I had to dash out and I missed a lot of Sean's presentation. So I was there at the beginning and the end, and now I'm here at the discussion. So I just want to make a comment rather than a question. But I think that, I see the whole story, such as it is, such as I know about it, as a very clear example of class conflict in the UK, and it shows what venal leaders we've got in our society in politics. The little fella or the little woman, or together they can have this kind of adventure and it'll come out okay. Whereas in fact, I believe that everything is stacked against those at the bottom in our society, and it's unremitting, and it just goes on and on and on. And so the questions that I would like to see answered, which comes back to the more general remit of this group, is how can we get more moral leadership in society? Why are we led by these people who are sociopaths who want to shaft us and at the same time want to tell us that they're not doing it? And most of society is being hoodwinked into believing that these are exceptional cases and they're not out to shaft us. And I just don't believe it. And to finish with, I'd just like to say that I believe that there are many, many cases in society where the victims get no respite and they remain unknown, unmentioned, unremembered, and they suffer in silence. And I'm thinking, of course, of many people we all know about. Victims of racism are the clearest example of that, who just have to, take what they're given, which is often lost much less than the others of us get, which is also, if we're not of a privileged class, much less than we deserve. Thank you, Chair.
Absolutely, Richard. I couldn't agree with you more. Sean, what would you like to come back with on that one?
Well, I probably largely agree there. I mean, the greatest worry for me currently is the lack of political engagement in, and I sound like an old fuddy-duddy here, in the younger generation, because most of the young people that I come across are completely disengaged politically, don't have a great interest in it. When you have a younger generation that gets most of its news content from TikTok and Facebook, that's a recipe for disaster going forward. And the other issue is that we talked about the justice system and the failings of that. One of the failings that we didn't touch on with that is the complete or virtual complete lack of now legal aid. We had a fairly, to use a post office term, robust legal aid system back in the 1980s, and then steadily that's been dismantled by successive governments, and none more so than the Conservative government and the coalition government, to the point now that the man or woman in the street has very little access to legal advice.
Yes, I think if I may come in here, I think the lack of legal aid is appalling. But Tony Benn had an idea which I think is absolutely marvelous, and that is that we have an NHS, a national health system. We need a national legal system as well, so that everyone, irrespective of means, has equal access to the law. It's really, really important that this is enacted. I think it's an absolutely essential idea, because as Richard just said, the poor have no access to justice through our legal system. And it's appalling, and it shouldn't be allowed to continue. We absolutely have to have every class in society has to have equal access to the law in order for there to be justice in society. I'm going to go back. Thanks very much, Richard and Sean, for those comments. I find those extremely, extremely pertinent. Steve, I'm going to bring Steve back in.
Excellent, yeah. Thank you, Carol. Some excellent contribution. All those questions, I did quite a lot of things. It was really interesting. I'm just going to comment on a couple of them. Mike took up the question of, quite rightly, crown power, of course, which is, I believe, central to this story. A corporate state body, really, in effect, political power. And it's a power relative to the weakness of the people. That concentration of power is the power taken away from people. It's not unconstrained, however. Although we're not a democracy, I would argue. Nevertheless, public opinion and what we do, and we can vote in elections, there are certain things, and we can have certain rights, means there is a constraint on the system. But Mike pointed out, of course, that when you get a whistleblower in this system, the first thing, the dark arts come straight into play to victimize that whistleblower. That's what was happening to the former chair of the post office. But he stuck to his guns. That made it difficult for them. He didn't just go away. He was quite stood his ground. I want to make a point. The Crown keeps things secret. It has a 30-year rule. We don't really ever get to find out what's going on till 30 years afterwards. That's why it always seems to take 30 years before we undo a scandal. And anything that's really secret is there for 50 years so that everybody's dead who can remember anything about it. So amnesia. I noticed when we had the COVID inquiry, Rishi Sunak couldn't remember anything that went on any day. I mean, he's only the Prime Minister. He didn't find out anything, knew nothing, couldn't remember anything. I mean, there's a little skit where you say he's saying all the number of times that he's saying can't remember anything. Tony, I think, made a very good point, and the courts were part of the story that we told of the Crown. They are part of the system of Crown power. Absolutely, they are. But Tony brought that in and raised it up the agenda with his comments, which are absolutely right. That's central to understanding this story. And I think Carol also made a very good point. Tony Benn's Commonwealth Bill, which is the only Republican bill to get anywhere near the House of Commons for a republic, included, as Carol's already told us, the idea of a national legal service. And this comes out so stark. It was at one point, it looked as if they would never be able to go to court until I think a barrister came forward and kind of offered to do it if he managed to get 500 people or something like that. I don't know how he managed to do it, but it's very, very difficult to do that. And I think that's something the left in general doesn't take seriously, and yet it's so central to this whole story, the way the legal system works. So I think I will probably maybe end at that point. I think John Spedding's points were also very good about the fact it's further up the food chain where everything's really happening. And what we have to do as socialists is to highlight the power of the state in all of this and not just keep it at the level of the post office, although that's where the battleground is.
Thank you very much. Phil Vellender, would you like to give some concluding remarks as well before I hand back to Sean?
Well, I think, unfortunately, because I'm leaving on Thursday, I've not been able to attend all the last discussion parts. So I'm going to cede my time to Sean. I think it'd be more productive.
Thanks very much.
Thank you anyway for listening to Stephen, my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to hand back to Sean now then to make some concluding remarks.
In conclusion, thank you very much for asking me along again and listening to me and putting the very interesting questions that you have done. I'm pleased that you enjoyed the first talk that we did a little while ago, and that you wanted me to speak again tonight. I'm happy to speak again in the future. And my apologies for messing you around last week. It was just one of those things, unfortunately.
That's absolutely fine. I mean, we knew that you were in some high-level meetings, and so that was obviously much more important. And it was fortunate that we were able to postpone our meeting till today. So I just want to say thank you. It's been a great meeting. Really good questions and contributions from the floor, and of course yourself in your answers have made it's been really, really good. Your answers have been fantastic. And I think everybody here feels that we actually know we've got a much clearer picture of what's going on. And unfortunately, it looks like compensation is still not just around the corner. It looks like we've got those sub-postmasters and mistresses have still got a long way to go. And some of them are bankrupt. Some of them have lost all their life savings and they're still waiting to get justice. Meanwhile, people have had bonuses because of the money stolen from them. People have got bonuses because they've brought about convictions. So people have made money out of the misery of these sub-postmasters, and it is absolutely appalling. So we just want to thank you once again for coming along and explaining so much more about what's happening. And
welcome.
If we can keep in touch, so you can keep us up to date, that would be great. Thank you very much, Sean, and thank you everybody else for coming tonight.